Hey guys, it's Skybird, and for a handful of minutes, I just wanted to chat about what might be the future of mold making for me. So if you guys are aware, if you've seen any of my previous videos, you know that the very first mold that I made that was successful was actually a cut mold, not a two-part mold. My two-part mold ended up screwing up, so I decided to make this in the time frame while it was curing, and this actually worked out reasonably well. The only issue that it has is an issue that I created, which is that I cut on the wrong side of the mask. I also hit my microphone. And so there's a scar on the front side of the Huna, which comes out of this. When you cut on the back side of the mask, it means that all of your parting lines are going to be on the back as well, which means that you're not going to have any issues when it comes to like cleanup and stuff like that. In some cases, you could do a rough cleanup for customers if they're not too particular about it. And then for more like invisible parting lines, it is possible with these. It just takes a little bit more effort. I may have come up with a method though to make future molds a little bit easier. So the main issue that I have with this mold here, as well as this book mold, which you can see why I ended up switching to this type, just because of the amount of material and also how much easier it can be to extract masks out of this. But there is one issue with it currently. In both of these cases, this is a Huna, this is a Ruru mold. I did not fill in any of the holes or block off any of the holes in the masks, whereas with the Rao, I did. This mask was actually a fail because of an issue with some discoloration where the venting is. I don't know what caused that. It's also the only mask that had that. There's a hair trying to get in my mouth. Anyway, but you can see here that there's very minimal flashing around the eyes, and in several cases I actually pulled this out where there's been zero flashing at all, and that's because these eyes I actually blocked off with tape when I was actually making the mold for it. The problem I ran into though is that the tape does leave a mark behind that will show up in transparent masks, so in the future I would like to be able to block off those holes but not leave a mark. And what I found, what was recommended, was actually a video by Robert Talone on YouTube, which is a massive resource in general when it comes to resin casting, though I've had some success in areas where they have not. And in this case here, what I would basically do, the Ruru, if you're familiar with this mask, has 5 holes in it, 2 at the bottom here, the eye holes, and the hole in the top of the head here. That one gives me the most trouble. Is I can actually take just a blob of clay, put it on one side, and basically push it into those holes. So the eye holes, the little holes at the bottom of the mask, and the top. And the idea is that I then go in on the inside and smooth it out. In this step, I really want to get it as flush as I possibly can. It does not need to be perfect, but the closer you get it to being flush, the less cleanup you're going to have to do later. So I just recommend doing it because that's a step you only have to do once, whereas cleanup is a step you have to do every single cast, right? So try to flush it out as best you can among the edges where the clay meets the plastic. The centers don't matter quite as much. And then you basically that basically creates a boat, right? This is all now filled in space. So you'll fill the inside of the mask with silicone and allow it to cure. Once it is cured, you remove the clay, do any cleanup you need to do with leftover clay, and then you will brush on or spray a mold release where those eye holes, where that forehead hole is. Essentially what you're doing is you now have silicone in this area and you're putting mold release on that silicone. I keep hitting my microphone. I'm very bad at this. Once the mold release is on there, you can then make the mold of your mask like you normally would. In the case of my book mold, that would be just attaching a funnel to this, attaching it to the base of some object like a cup, and then pouring the silicone around the mask. In this case, you may want to rotate the mask a little bit just to prevent bubbles from accumulating, because since those holes are blocked off now, bubbles might accumulate, but you shouldn't have any major issues because your silicone is already pressed up against that. But you may, so you might want to rotate it a little bit. Shouldn't be a huge problem. With that said, the silicone will bond on the backside because you didn't put mold release on the back, but it should release on the front wherever the silicone is touching those holes because you did put mold release. It acts as a physical barrier there. And that means that when you go to extract the mask later from this piece, you don't have to cut out the eyes and the forehead hole and the little jaw holes like you would with this mold. When I made this mold, because I didn't block out those holes, I had to actually go in there with my knife and cut out the eyes and the forehead. And yeah, it looks a little bit messy, but the mask is still going to come out reasonably clean. It's just going to leave me a lot of flashing to clean up in the future. This mask has already been somewhat cleaned, but you can see mold lines and stuff still that I could definitely clean up more. This is not a mask that I would be selling, so I'm not worried about cleaning it up any more than this. But if this method works out, it should leave me either no flashing or just a thin film where flashing might be. That is very easy to cut out because it's just a straight line. And in that case, it also makes removing the mother item, the item that you actually molded in resin from the you molded in resin, that you molded in silicone, removing that item from the silicone, because in that case, all you need to do is create a vertical slice down the mask to the funnel, and then create your horizontal slice. In this case, I created the horizontal slice on the side here to meet the top of the mask, because that's where the top of the mask is. And that essentially releases the top from the mold, so that when I split the book mold down the center, I just push on the mask in with my thumb right here, and the mask should, in theory, release. But because I have all that leftover silicone from what I had to cut, that prevents the mask from coming out super neatly. So I have to do a little bit more finagling to actually get the mask out of there. If those cuts were made clean, aka if I had filled those holes and didn't have to do any cutting at all, then all I would have to do is just split it and push the mask out, and it should, in theory, pop out with very little resistance. And for future molds, including my new Huna mold, which I just made, instead of doing the cut horizontal here, I'm going to actually do my cuts on the top of the mold and basically follow the line where the mask is. And what that's going to do is that is going to do, well, it's going to do two things. First of all, it'll prevent resin from leaking out of these sides. I don't have a major issue with that, but when I'm kind of tapping it around or flicking it to get rid of bubbles or squishing it a little bit to move bubbles around, those seams can split and resin can leak out of the sides there. Not a major deal. Cleanup on that is fairly easy, but if I do that vertical line, that's going to prevent some overspill, but it also essentially acts as a vent, because when I actually put this in the pressure pot's going to be pushing down basically on all sides of this at once, but it's also going to be pushing down on that funnel. And as it does, it pushes the resin down further. The resin's going to push on the bubbles at the high points. And if I make the top of the head the high point, and then I make my incision there, the bubbles will be forced out of that incision. And I won't have to actually make any vents, but also the bubbles can evacuate. Does that make sense? So that, in theory, would save me steps in cleaning the flashing and with the bubble, as mentioned. There's also technically another thing I could do where I actually make the mold essentially a two-part mold, sort of, where I fill this with silicone. That's the wrong mask. Where I fill this with silicone, but essentially up to the surface. So I would have to do this with a thick silicone, but something that won't bond. And then I would rub all sides of the silicone with mold release, essentially submerge it in the book mold from that point, cut this down, and then when I open this up, I would pull the mask and that second bit of silicone out, then remount the silicone. It's a weird thing. It may not possibly work, but if it does work, then in theory, that would leave me with zero parting lines in any surface except for where the vent connects, which would be huge, but it would be a much more difficult process. Especially getting it to actually set properly each time. There are obviously some caveats and stuff to it. So interesting, worth looking into. But my main concern right now is just the filling of the eye holes. I personally want to try and create a substance that can kind of do this for me rather than the clay. So I've been looking up, I know this is going to sound super niche, but essentially like the science of like bubbles and how bubbles work, to try and create a bubble that starts out as a thin liquid and is water soluble, but can be rubbed across a hole, in this case something like this here, form a bubble skin there, and then dry out in air and become a solid mass. So that essentially, instead of having to do all that work with the clay, I would just literally run my fingers across it, a bubble would form there, and then the bubble wouldn't pop, it would just dry out and become a film. Does that make sense? That would need to be something that doesn't inhibit the curing of silicone, though. So that obviously adds some difficulty and intricacy to it. There are a lot of things, and I have been experimenting with it, but turns out trying to make bubbles that don't pop but are also thin enough to apply with your fingers is very difficult. It's also not the kind of material that would work for every kind of surface. The Picari, for example, would be a really difficult one because the holes in that mask actually turn at nearly a 90-degree. So trying to make a bubble across that would not be easy. But it's just something worth playing around with. So if I come up with something like that, that's actually a really, really nice product for future mold casting, because it's something I could go back to over and over again when it comes to making molds, and it would be huge just in general. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you guys did enjoy the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Of course, if you like what I'm doing here, you can always make a donation to my Patreon. I am overhauling how the Patreon works, so there will be an exclusive Discord channel in the server, as well as some exclusive content for you guys as well. Videos and things like that here in the near future, maybe some explanations on different types of mechanisms and stuff, but I'll get into that once I know exactly where I want to go with all this stuff. We also just hit 700 subscribers on YouTube, so that's always a big little celebration there. 199 Rahi, so we're just one away from the 200 milestone, which is massive. And yeah, so Patreon, Discord, Instagram will all be linked in the description below. I, of course, recommend you checking those out if you want to follow along with my progress when it comes to resin casting. And I also plan on doing more of a full video on the process when it comes to actually creating my molds, opening the mold, like how to actually extract the items and doing casts and stuff with them as well in the future. So hopefully my experiments tonight with the clay I have are going to work so that I can do those for you guys in the future. Anyway, I'll see you all in the next one. Make sure to like and subscribe. Later.